The voice on the recording was my son's. I recognized it the way you recognize a song you haven't heard in 30 years, instantly, in your bones, before your mind even catches up. She won't fight it, he said. Not at his age. Not after what we give him. And if he does, that was my daughter-in-law, Nicole. He won't. He's 69 years old. He gets tired walking to the mailbox. What's he going to do? Hire a lawyer? We'll have the house transferred before he even figures out what happened. There was a pause. Then Nicole again, her voice dropping to something that wasn't quite a whisper but wasn't quite normal either. And the accounts? All of it, my son said. Every last dollar. I sat in Detective Karen Okafor's office at the Asheville Police Department and listened to that recording 3 times. The detective watched my face carefully, the way doctors watch a patient when they're delivering a diagnosis they're not sure the patient can handle. I knew that look. I'd used it myself for 31 years in operating rooms across North Carolina. Mr. Hargrove, she said carefully, I know this is difficult. Play it again, I said. She did. The 3rd time I listened, I heard something I'd missed before. In the background, barely audible beneath my son's voice, was the sound of a television, a specific program, a cooking show I'd watched every Sunday morning since my wife passed. The show that played only in one room of my house, the kitchen. They'd recorded this conversation in my kitchen. In my home, the home I'd bought in 1991, the year my son was born, the year I finished my residency and took my first real paycheck to a real estate agent and said, I want something with a yard because someday I'm going to have a child who needs one. I need to make a phone call, I told Detective Okafor. Before we go any further, I need to call my attorney. She nodded. She slid a box of tissues across the desk. I didn't touch them. I called Margaret Whitfield, who had handled my estate planning for 12 years and who had, 6 months earlier, looked at me across her mahogany desk and said, Franklin, I hope you're wrong about this. I'd told her then what I suspected. She told me to get proof. I was getting proof. It started, I told her when she picked up. There was a brief silence. Then, where are you? Asheville PD, Detective Okafor's office. Don't say another word to anyone. I'll be there in 40 minutes. I set the phone down and looked out the window at the Blue Ridge Mountains in the distance. It was October, and the leaves were turning orange and red and gold, the way they did every year, the way they had turned the autumn. I brought my son home from the hospital, wrapped in a yellow blanket, the way they had turned every year of his life that I could remember. Beautiful and impermanent. Gone before you were ready. I had been a cardiac surgeon for 31 years. I had held human hearts in my hands. I had repaired them, restarted them, coaxed them back to life when every reasonable metric said they should stop. I had learned, in those years, that the heart is a more resilient organ than most people believe. It can survive an extraordinary amount of damage and keep beating, but it remembers everything. My son's name is Derek. He is 32 years old, and until 3 years ago, we had the kind of relationship that other men described, with a mixture of admiration and vague envy. Close, respectful, easy. We watched football together on Sundays. We drove up to Boone every spring for a fishing weekend we'd been taking since he was 8 years old. When my wife, Carol, was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, Derek drove 4 hours from Charlotte every weekend for 14 months to sit with her. He held her hand at the end. He met Nicole 14 months after Carol died. I remember the first time he brought her to the house, a Sunday dinner in April, 2 years ago. She was attractive in a careful, deliberate way, the kind of attractive that takes significant effort but is assembled to look effortless. She asked about the house and its history and its square footage with an interest that I initially mistook for genuine curiosity. I am a cardiac surgeon. I have spent 31 years reading people in moments of extreme stress, which is the only kind of moment that matters. You learn to see past what people want you to see and read what's actually there. By the end of that first dinner, I had read Nicole clearly enough to know that her interest in my home was not sentimental. I didn't say anything to Derek. Not then. I told myself I was being unfair, that I was projecting my grief for Carol onto anyone who occupied space in my son's life. I watched. I paid attention. I waited. Over the following months, Derek began changing in small ways that were easy to dismiss individually, but impossible to ignore collectively. He stopped initiating our fishing trips. He started asking questions about my retirement accounts, framed as, "Concerned, Dad, have you thought about long-term care insurance? Have you considered what happens if you need full-time care someday?" He mentioned, twice, that the house was probably too large for one person, and that downsizing made financial sense. Nicole, meanwhile, made herself indispensable. She organized my kitchen. She drove me to a cardiology appointment when my car was in the shop, and spent the entire drive asking, with great apparent warmth, about my medications and my prognosis. She began referring to my house as the property in casual conversation, the way a real estate agent might. In January of this year, Derek asked if he and Nicole could move in temporarily. Their lease was ending, he said, and the Charlotte rental market was brutal. Just 6 months, just to save a deposit for something bigger. I said yes. Of course I said yes. He was my son. They moved in on a Thursday. By the following Tuesday, Nicole had rearranged the living room. I am a patient man. 31 years of surgery will do that to you, teach you that impatience kills, that the hands that cannot wait are the hands that lose patience on the table. I watched, and I recorded, and I documented, and I said nothing, and I made a phone call to Margaret Whitfield that would turn out to be the most important phone call of my life. Margaret listened for 40 minutes while I laid it out, the questions about assets, the behavior changes in Derek, the way Nicole walked through rooms with the quiet proprietary air of someone calculating square footage. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Franklin," she said, "you need to understand what you're describing. If they're planning what you think they're planning, document everything, every conversation you can, every account access, every unusual request." "I already have a camera system," I said. "I installed it after Carol died. Security system, interior and exterior." "Do they know about it?" "No." Another pause. "Then let's talk about your will." We talked for 2 more hours. When we were done, I had a plan. I also had, for the first time since moving them in, a feeling that was not dread, but something closer to clarity. I had diagnosed the problem. Now I needed to treat it. What followed over the next 4 months was the most methodical thing I had ever done, and I have performed 11,000 cardiac surgeries. I began keeping a second set of financial records, meticulous and encrypted, on a laptop I stored at my office at the hospital, where I still consulted 2 days a week. I noted every time Derek accessed the filing cabinet, where I kept property documents 4 times in February alone. I noted every time Nicole asked about my health in ways that seemed designed to establish a narrative of decline. I noted the afternoon in March when I came home early from the hospital and heard them talking in the kitchen and stopped in the hallway and listened. That was the conversation Detective Okafor had played for me this morning. I had recorded it on my home system. I had then, very quietly, made a copy and delivered it to Margaret, who had delivered it to the police with a formal letter documenting the broader pattern of behavior. Detective Okafor had spent 3 weeks building context around it before calling me in. Now, Margaret was sitting beside me in that office, and Detective Okafor was laying out what they had found. "Your son accessed your online banking portal 11 times in the past 60 days, the detective said. "We have the IP records. He didn't change anything, but he was clearly mapping the accounts, learning what was there, what could be moved, how it was structured." "How much is there?" Margaret asked. Not because she didn't know, but because she wanted it on record. "The accounts total approximately $2.3 million, I said, plus the house, which appraised at $850 last fall. "Nicole Hargrove," the detective continued, "made contact 6 weeks ago with a man named Dennis Pruitt, who is a notary with a history of involvement in fraudulent estate document preparation. We have the emails. She was asking about the cost and process of preparing a modified power of attorney." I looked at the folder on the detective's desk. My son's name was on the tab, written in blue pen in someone's neat administrative handwriting. Derek James Hargrove. I had chosen that name. I had stood in a hospital room 32 years ago and written it on a form with hands that were still shaking from the best kind of shock, the kind where life becomes suddenly, overwhelmingly more than it was the moment before. "What do you need from me?" I asked. Detective Okafor looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at me. "We'd like to let it proceed a little further," the detective said carefully. "The recording is strong, but a jury responds better to completed actions than to stated intentions. If they actually file the fraudulent documents, then you have them cold, I said. Yes. I thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. All right, I said. Tell me what to do. What I did was nothing. That was the hardest part. I went home, and I smiled at my son over dinner, and I let Nicole refill my coffee without noting that I hadn't asked her to, and I said nothing while they discussed, in voices just low enough to seem private, the maintenance costs of a house this size. I went to my room, and I closed the door, and I sat in the chair by the window where Carol used to read, and I was still. In the second week of April, Derek sat across from me at the kitchen table with an expression I had seen before, the expression of someone delivering news they've decided to frame as helpful. He had a folder. He slid it across the table. Dad, he said, I've been thinking about your financial situation. I looked at the folder. I didn't touch it. Have you? You've got a lot of assets tied up in illiquid places. The house, especially. Nicole did some research, I said. She's trying to help. We both are. There's a management structure we've been looking at that would put me in a better position to handle things if something were to happen to you. A durable power of attorney, primarily, and a restructuring of the trust. Derek. I said his name quietly, the way I used to when he was a boy and had done something that required my full attention. He stopped. I'll have Margaret look at it. Something moved behind his eyes, a flicker of recalculation. Of course, he said. That's completely reasonable. He left the folder on the table. I left it there for an hour before I picked it up and photographed every page and sent the images to Margaret and Detective Okafor. The proposed power of attorney would have given Derek control of every account and the authority to execute property transfers. The trust modification, written in language designed to sound like estate planning, would have allowed him to initiate a sale of the house and direct proceeds to an account that was not mine. Dennis Pruitt had done careful work. It almost looked legitimate. 2 days later, Nicole asked if she could drive me to my Tuesday consultation at the hospital. She had never offered before. I said yes. In the car, she asked how I was feeling, whether I'd been sleeping, whether I'd been experiencing any memory difficulties. Her voice was warm, and her eyes, when I glanced at them, were measuring. I told her I'd been a little forgetful lately, just small things, nothing to worry about. She nodded, and I watched her file that information away like a document she planned to retrieve later. I had been, at that point, performing the role of a man in mild cognitive decline for approximately 3 weeks. I forgot where I'd put things, slightly too often. I repeated a story at dinner that I'd told the previous week. I asked Derek once, with precisely calibrated uncertainty, whether I'd already taken my morning medications. He told me yes, though I hadn't asked him to monitor them. I have a medical degree from Duke and 3 decades of clinical practice, performing a convincing portrait of early cognitive impairment for an audience motivated to believe it required very little effort. I understood exactly what symptoms they were hoping to see. I gave them a careful, plausible version of those symptoms, documented on my home system every single day, time-stamped and cataloged. The day the fraudulent documents were filed with the Buncombe County Register of Deeds, I was in Margaret's office when she got the alert from the court monitoring service she'd set up. She looked at me across her desk, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "That's it," she said. "Yes," I said. "How do you feel?" I thought about it honestly, the way Carol used to ask me to think about things, not the reflexive answer, but the real one. "Like I've been watching a surgery go wrong for months," I said, "and I finally have the clamps in place to stop the bleeding." Detective Okafor moved quickly after that. The arrest happened on a Wednesday morning. I was not in the house. I had been staying at a colleague's guest room for 3 days, which Derek and Nicole had been told was a fishing trip. I watched the arrest on my phone via the security system feed 2 Asheville PD officers and 1 from the County Financial Crimes Unit, my son's face going the color of concrete when he opened the door, Nicole's voice rising into something that wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite speech. The charges were extensive: fraud in the first degree, forgery of a legal instrument, financial exploitation of an older adult, which carries enhanced penalties in North Carolina, conspiracy, and, because of the recording in which Nicole had discussed a plan to handle my health situation in ways that the DA's office interpreted, correctly I think, as something more serious than financial manipulation, 1 count of conspiracy to commit elder abuse with intent to cause serious harm. Their attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, who wore pocket squares and had the particular confidence of someone who had won cases he shouldn't have won, filed a motion to suppress the home recording within the first week. He argued I had no right to record conversations in common areas of a home I shared with other adults. Margaret's response was 12 pages long and cited North Carolina recording statutes with a specificity that suggested she had been preparing it for some time. The motion was denied. The trial began on a Monday in November. Asheville is not a large city, and a case involving a retired cardiac surgeon, a fraudulent estate transfer, and a conspiracy charge attracted the kind of attention that filled the courtroom gallery with people who brought coffee thermoses and settled into their seats with the comfortable air of people who expected to be entertained. I took my seat in the front row and did not look at Derek until he was brought in. When I did look, what I saw was a man I had once known very well, and now recognized only in the way you recognize a street you grew up on after 20 years. The basic structure still there, the details all wrong. Nicole sat beside him in a suit jacket that was slightly too formal for the context, her hands folded on the table with a precision that told me she had been coached extensively. She glanced at me once, early. I held her gaze until she looked away. The prosecution opened by playing the kitchen recording. Foss objected twice during the playback, both times on grounds the judge overruled before he finished speaking. The jury, 9 women, 3 men, ranging in age from mid-20s to mid-60s, listened with the focused stillness of people hearing something that confirms a suspicion they already had. The financial forensics were next. An analyst from the DA's office walked the jury through the banking access logs. The 11 occasions Derek had mapped my accounts, the $340,000 in fraudulent property liens Nicole had arranged through Dennis Pruitt, the fraudulent power of attorney, the forged trust modification which contained a signature mine that had been reproduced from a copy of my actual signature on a document Nicole had photographed in my filing cabinet. Foss did his best. He called a handwriting expert who testified that the signature reproduction was of good quality, implying that I might have signed the document and forgotten doing so. He called a neuropsychologist who had never examined me, but who testified at length about cognitive impairment in adults over 65, building a portrait of a forgetful old man who might sign anything put in front of him. It was, professionally speaking, solid work. I watched it being dismantled with the particular satisfaction of someone who has spent months preparing for exactly this. Margaret called my colleague Dr. James Rutherford, the chief of neurology at Mission Hospital, who had administered a comprehensive cognitive assessment to me 6 weeks before the fraudulent documents were filed. I had requested the assessment specifically, without telling Derek or Nicole, and had asked Dr. Rutherford to keep the results confidential until authorized for release. My scores placed me in the 91st percentile for men my age. Perfect recall, above average processing speed, no indicators of any impairment whatsoever. When did you conduct this assessment? Margaret asked. September 14th, Dr. Rutherford said. 8 weeks before the fraudulent documents were filed. The jury saw it. Foss saw it. Derek and Nicole saw it. The cognitive decline had not been real. The man they had spent months convinced was slipping away had been, the entire time, watching them with the full and undamaged attention of a surgeon. Foss put Derek on the stand in the 3rd week. It was a calculated risk. Derek presented well. He was articulate. He was someone a jury might instinctively want to believe. He sat in the witness box with the contained composure of a man who had rehearsed for many hours and spoke about his concern for my well-being, his desire to ensure my assets were protected, his genuine fear that I was not capable of managing my own affairs. He described Nicole as a supportive partner, acting from love, not calculation. He described himself as a dutiful son, worried about his father, trying to do the right thing. Margaret let him talk. She had learned this from 30 years of practice. Let them build the structure before you take out the foundation. When his attorney was done, she stood and walked to the center of the room and looked at Derek for a moment without speaking. Derek met her eyes. He was still composed. "Tell me," she said, "when your mother was dying, did your father stay by her side?" Foss objected. Relevance. The judge allowed it. Derek said yes. "And when you lost your job in 2021, she continued, who provided the financial support that allowed you to keep your apartment for 8 months? A pause. "My father." When you needed a cosigner for your car loan in 2022, who did that for you? Another pause. My father. She walked to the evidence table and picked up a folder. She opened it and placed it in front of Derek. This is the financial analysis of your father's accounts over the past 18 months. In that period, how much money did he transfer to you for various stated needs? Derek looked at the document. His composure had developed a small crack along one edge, barely visible but there. I don't know the exact figure. The exact figure, Margaret said, is $87,400. She let that settle. That's what your father gave you willingly, freely, because you asked and he loved you. She paused. And the amount the prosecution has documented you attempted to take without his knowledge or consent is $340,000, plus a house worth $850,000. She looked at him steadily. Correct me if the math is wrong. Derek said nothing. Was there a reason, she asked, that you didn't simply ask your father for help, the way you had before? Another long silence. I watched my son's face, and what I saw there was not the answer to the question she was asking, but the answer to a different question. One that had been sitting in my chest since October like a piece of shrapnel I'd been careful not to move. He didn't answer because the answer was Nicole. Because Nicole had arrived with a different set of calculations, a different map of what was possible, and she had redrawn his understanding of what he was owed and what he had the right to take. He had let her do it. That was his choice. And his alone, and no attorney and no jury and no amount of testimony about spousal influence would change the fact that at some point, on some ordinary Tuesday or Thursday in the past 2 years, my son had looked at everything I had built and decided it should already be his. That was the hardest thing. Not the fraud, not the conspiracy, the decision behind it. The jury deliberated for 2 days. I spent those days at my colleague's house, reading, walking along the French Broad River in the November cold, eating meals I barely tasted. My colleague, a thoracic surgeon named Paul, who had known me for 20 years, sat with me on the second evening and didn't ask me how I was doing, which was the right choice. It's almost over, he said. Almost, I agreed. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the courtroom for it, front row, Margaret beside me. Derek and Nicole were brought in, and for a moment, just a moment, Derek looked at me with something I couldn't entirely read. Not remorse exactly. Something more complicated and less clean. The look of a man who has made a series of choices that seemed individually defensible and has arrived at a destination he cannot defend at all. The foreman read the verdicts in a voice that was careful and deliberate, and each one landed in the courtroom like something being set down permanently. Guilty on all counts. Both of them. Every charge. Nicole's sentence was lighter than Derek's by 3 years, because the prosecution could demonstrate that she had been the architect, where Derek had been the contractor, but Foss had spent 2 weeks arguing for treatment and rehabilitation, and the DA's office had accepted a plea modification that reduced her conspiracy charge. It was a negotiated outcome that I thought was too lenient and that Margaret told me was within the normal range for first-time offenders with competent representation. Why does she get less? People would ask later, in ways that made their own answer clear. Because the law distinguishes between planning and doing, Margaret would say, and sometimes that distinction feels inadequate. That's not wrong. It often is inadequate. But it's what we have. Derek received 6 years in the North Carolina Department of Adult Correction, plus a restitution order of $87,400, representing the documented fraudulent transfer attempts and associated legal costs. Nicole received 3 years plus the same restitution. Jointly liable. The Dennis Pruitt matter was handled separately. He accepted a plea in exchange for his cooperation and received 18 months. After the sentencing, as the courtroom cleared, I did something Margaret had advised against. I walked to where Derek stood with his appointed transport officer, and I stopped a few feet away. Derek looked at me, and the thing I'd seen in his eyes during the verdict was still there, unresolved. I want to ask you something, I said. He waited. Do you remember the summer you were 11? We drove out to the Outer Banks for a week. You learned to body surf. You got knocked down by a wave the first afternoon and came up sputtering and laughing. You went back in immediately. I paused. Do you remember that? Something moved across his face. Yes. That's the last thing I'm going to hold on to, I said. That's the version of you I'm choosing to remember. Because the man standing in front of me right now is someone I don't know, and I don't think I want to. He opened his mouth, closed it. 6 years is a long time, I said. Long enough to figure out how you got here. I genuinely hope you use it. I looked at him for another moment, and then I turned and walked away, and I did not look back, because there was nothing more I needed to see. The house sold in December. Not for what it had appraised at the market had softened, but for $810,000, which was more money than I needed and more than I wanted to hold. The closing took 45 minutes in Margaret's conference room. I signed the papers with the same steady hands that had held open human hearts, and I felt, when the pen left the paper, a lightness that surprised me with its completeness. I had already arranged the distribution of the proceeds before the closing, a significant portion to the Justice for Elders Legal Fund, which provides free legal representation to older adults facing financial exploitation, a portion to Mission Hospital's Cardiac Research Endowment, in Carol's name, the remainder into a scholarship at UNC Asheville for first-generation nursing students. Because Carol had been a nurse before she became ill, and because the nurses had been kinder to her at the end than I knew how to thank them for. Derek would have known about none of this. He had built his plans around a number my net worth, as he had calculated it from those 11 sessions of unauthorized account access, and that number was gone now, distributed into the world in ways that would outlast all three of us. I moved to Brevard in January. Small city, 25 miles southwest of Asheville, in the shadow of Pisgah National Forest. I bought a house on a quiet road with a back deck that overlooks a creek. 3 bedrooms, a reading room I've already filled with books that have been in boxes for years, a kitchen window that faces east, which means I drink my morning coffee in the best light of the day. I still consult at Mission 2 days a week. The other 5 days are mine. I've started hiking seriously. The forest is right there, endless trails, and I am 69 years old and still healthy, and there is no reason not to. I joined a chess club that meets Wednesday evenings in a bookstore downtown. There are 7 of us, ranging from a retired high school principal to a 24-year-old software engineer who plays with an aggression I find entertaining to dismantle. Chess is a game of preparation. Every grandmaster will tell you that the outcome of a match is usually determined not in the dramatic moments of sacrifice and gambit, but in the quiet earlier moves, the positioning, the patient construction of an advantage so subtle your opponent doesn't see it until it's already irreversible. You don't win by reacting. You win by having already thought further ahead than anyone else at the table. Margaret called last month to check in. We talked for an hour about nothing in particular, a recent case of hers, a hiking trail I discovered, the weather. At the end, she said, "How are you, really, Franklin?" I looked out the kitchen window at the creek, which was running high from a recent rain, silver and quick in the winter light. "I'm good," I said. And then, because she deserved the real answer, I miss my son, not the one from the trial. The 11-year-old who got knocked down by a wave and went right back in. I was quiet for a moment. I don't know what happened to him. I'm not sure it matters now. But I miss him. She didn't try to fix it or reframe it or find the useful lesson in it. She just said, "I know," and meant it. We said goodbye, and I poured another cup of coffee, and I took it out to the back deck and sat down and watched the creek and let myself miss him for a while. The boy he had been, the future I had imagined for us, the fishing trips and the Sunday afternoons and all the small, ordinary things that were gone now and would not come back. And then I picked up the coffee, and I watched the water, and I breathed. And the breathing was steady and clear. I have held human hearts in my hands. I know what it means for a damaged thing to keep beating. I know the difference between damage that ends function and damage that the body integrates, carries, makes part of the ongoing work of staying alive. That Sunday, I drove out to a lake I'd found east of Brevard, put a kayak in the water at 7 in the morning, paddled until the sun was full overhead, ate a sandwich on the bank, read a chapter of a novel I'd been meaning to finish for 2 years, drove home in the late afternoon with the windows down, even though it was cold, because the air smelled clean. That evening, my Wednesday chess club was meeting. The retired principal had been studying opening theory and was going to try something ambitious. I was looking forward to it. I'd already thought 4 moves ahead. I usually do.